The air backstage smelled of formaldehyde from the professor's ceremonial robes and the metallic tang of my own terror. I stood rigidly in my velvet-trimmed doctoral gown. My PhD had draped across my shoulders like a crown I hadn't yet earned the right to wear. My hands trembled as I clutched my phone, watching the notification light up with a message from my mother, 31 years old. 7 years of grueling, sleepless nights. A doctorate in forensic accounting earned through sacrifice that no one in my family would ever truly comprehend. And this. Honestly, Lillian, stop being so dramatic. Leo needs us. His new girlfriend is at his house, and they need cash for party supplies right now. Your graduation is just a piece of paper, sweetie. Leo's happiness and his business is the priority. We have to go. You can take a selfie. I read the words 3 times, waiting for them to rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They didn't. The auditorium doors were opening. I could hear the processional music beginning. Pomp and circumstance. The same song that had echoed through my childhood. When my parents attended my brother's high school graduation, his college graduation, his failed business launch party. They had never missed a single moment of Leo's mediocrity, but they had just canceled mine. My heart felt like shattered glass inside my chest. Not from shock. I had learned long ago that shock was a luxury my family could not afford me. But from the casual cruelty of it, they didn't scramble for an excuse. They didn't lie and say there was traffic or a family emergency, or that they'd changed their seats. They simply told me that my life's work, my sacrifice, my achievement, was less important than liquor for my 35-year-old brother's pool party. I straightened my academic hood with shaking fingers and walked toward the stage entrance. The woman looking back at me from the glass doors was someone I didn't recognize, pale, hollow, a ghost in expensive ceremonial robes. But I walked anyway. My name is Lillian Hayes. I didn't just earn that doctorate. I bled for it. During my master's program, when my parents' business, the Hayes Collection, a high-end home goods chain with 7 locations, faced its first major audit crisis 4 years ago, they didn't call in a professional accountant. They called me. They pulled me out of my master's program mid-semester and told me, with tears streaming down their faces, that I had a choice: continue my education or save them from prison. They framed it as love. You owe us, Lillian. We paid for your braces. We sent you to private school. As if my childhood had been a loan with interest due. I chose them. I spent 18 months cooking books, hiding cash flows, moving money through carefully constructed digital shadows. I became an artist of fraud, not because I wanted to, but because the alternative was watching my parents lose everything. Watching Leo lose access to his trust fund and his unlimited credit line. The irony, which I understood even then, was that Leo was the reason we needed saving in the first place. My brother had never worked a day in his life. Our parents had promoted him to VP of Business Development at the Hayes Collection when he turned 25, a title that meant nothing and paid everything. While I worked night shifts at a local accounting firm to finance my graduate degree, Leo spent his days making increasingly expensive purchases that made no business sense. Vintage sports cars, elaborate parties, memberships to clubs where he networked with other rich men's sons who were equally useless. And he treated the company's bank accounts like his personal ATM. He had been slowly, methodically draining the business for nearly a decade. By the time the audit crisis happened, the damage was catastrophic. But my parents couldn't blame their golden child. They couldn't admit that the son they had spent my entire childhood praising, the one they had always chosen over me, had been destroying everything we had. So they chose me to be the fixer. After I spent 18 months cleaning up Leo's mess, a mess so complex that I had to forge documents, manipulate inventory records, and commit my own crimes to cover his, I returned to my studies. But I was no longer just a graduate student. I was someone with a secret, someone with liability, someone who understood in the deepest part of my soul that my family had asked me to commit felonies to protect them, and then expected me to act as if it was a normal Tuesday. I finished my master's degree. I applied to doctoral programs. I was accepted to study forensic accounting, the irony so thick I could taste it. And I spent the next 3 years working days, studying nights, and secretly managing the failing books of the Hayes collection whenever my parents called with another emergency. My parents constantly reminded me of my place in the family hierarchy. Why forensic accounting, Lillian? That sounds so boring. My father, Arthur, had scoffed last week during one of his weekly calls, begging me to come back to the office. Leo is building something tangible, something people see. What my father didn't understand, what he would never understand, was that Leo was still actively destroying something tangible. And I was the only thing standing between his criminal incompetence and total bankruptcy. I was the only reason they still had a business. I was the only reason they weren't in prison. And they had just told me my doctorate was just a piece of paper. I walked across that stage and accepted my diploma with a forced, brilliant smile. I gave my planned speech on corporate ethics, the irony of which felt like a knife wound, and every word tasted like ash. My voice didn't shake. My hands didn't tremble. I had spent too many years performing competence for people who took it for granted. When the ceremony ended, I walked backstage and called my mother. She didn't answer. I tried my father. Voicemail. I sent them both a text. Congratulations. I graduated. No response came until 9 p.m. It was from Leo. Hey sis. Mom and Dad said your thing went well. They're throwing me a surprise birthday dinner tomorrow. You should come. My doctorate ceremony had ended at 2 p.m. They had been at Leo's pool party for 7 hours by that point. I didn't respond. Instead, I went home to my tiny apartment, the one I could barely afford on my graduate school stipend and night shift wages, and I made a decision. I was going to leave, but first I needed to protect myself. The strategic plan crystallized over the next 48 hours of sleepless clarity. My doctorate was my ticket to freedom. But I couldn't simply walk away. If I abandoned my family without cleaning up the books one final time, I would be complicit in ongoing fraud. I would have liability. I would spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for a federal agent to show up at my door. I needed to create distance. Legal, professional, institutional distance. I needed a job that would put me on the other side of the law, the side that mattered. The side that protected. I spent 3 days researching banks. I needed one that held the Hayes collection's largest commercial loans. A bank where my expertise would be valuable. A bank where I could position myself in their fraud division, where I would have access to internal systems, where my future employer would trust me with their most sensitive cases. I found it, Northwood Financial. They held the primary commercial loan for my family's business. And they had a department I had never heard of before. Internal audit and fraud investigation. I crafted an application that was almost entirely true. I highlighted my PhD in forensic accounting. I mentioned my perfect 4.0 GPA. I emphasized my expertise in identifying complex inventory fraud schemes. I did not mention the Hayes collection. I did not mention my family. I did not mention that I had been committing crimes for 4 years to keep them solvent. Instead, I focused on my passion for corporate ethics and my desire to protect financial institutions from the devastating effects of internal fraud. The irony was so perfect, it almost made me smile. I scheduled interviews strategically. I wanted them to see me as a brilliant, dedicated professional, which I was. I wanted them to see someone who understood fraud from a theoretical, academic perspective, which was also true, albeit incompletely. And I wanted them to want me desperately. While I waited to hear back from Northwood, a shift happened at home. My mother called, her voice sharp with the tone of entitlement I had learned to recognize across 15 years of family phone calls. Lillian, you need to handle this immediately. Leo is having a terrible day. He has a headache. The store's utility bill is overdue, and the power is about to be shut off. You know how to access the emergency fund. I had known this moment would come. The moment they would call with a crisis, expecting me to solve it immediately. It was the moment I needed to be ready for. I'm busy updating my resume, Mom, I said quietly. You need to call Leo. It's his business. The silence on the line was profound. In my family, I didn't say no. I said yes. And then I stayed up until 3 a.m., making it happen. Lillian, don't be ridiculous. I'm hanging up now, Mom. Call Leo. I disconnected the call and turned off my phone. She called back 9 times over the next 2 hours. I didn't answer. By the next morning, I discovered they had handled it themselves. The utility company had accepted a late payment and the power stayed on. My small act of rebellion had worked. But there was something else I needed to do. Something that required access to the company's servers. I told my parents I needed to come into the office to retrieve some personal items I had left in my old desk. My father seemed relieved. He probably thought I was going to cave, that I was going to return to the role of family fixer. He didn't know that I had already scheduled interviews with Northwood Financial for the following week. I arrived at the Hayes collection early, before anyone else had come in, and I sat down at the company's server with my old credentials. I had maintained access even after I had stopped working full-time, and I used it now to do a deep dive into the accounting systems. What I found made my blood go cold. It wasn't just embezzlement. Leo hadn't simply been stealing cash, moving money into his personal accounts, and spending it on parties and sports cars. That would have been bad enough. But this was worse. My brother was systematically buying and selling expensive inventory. Designer furniture, high-end lighting fixtures, luxury home accessories worth hundreds of thousands of dollars between the Hayes collection and a shadowy shell corporation that he had set up under a fake name. The inventory didn't exist. The transactions were fabricated. The money was laundered through a complex web of false invoices, shell companies, and offshore accounts. Leo was committing bank fraud on a massive scale. He was artificially inflating the Hayes collection's asset value to secure new loans, larger loans, that he would inevitably steal from as well. My entire family was not facing bankruptcy or jail time. They were facing federal prison, money laundering charges, bank fraud charges, tax evasion charges that came with mandatory minimum sentences. I had spent 7 years of my life covering for these people. I had sacrificed my education, my career, my freedom, and in the end they had buried themselves so deeply in crime that my years of careful, illegal book cooking looked like a misdemeanor. I copied the evidence onto an encrypted external hard drive, covering my tracks carefully. Then I walked out of the Hayes collection for what I intended to be the last time. My interview with Mr. Davies, the head of fraud investigation at Northwood Financial, took place on a Tuesday morning in a glass conference room overlooking the city skyline. Mr. Davies was a stern man in his early 60s, with sharp eyes that seemed to see through to the center of who you were. He had reviewed my resume carefully. He knew my credentials were exceptional, but he wanted to understand why someone with a PhD in forensic accounting wanted to work in a regional bank's fraud division instead of pursuing a lucrative consulting career. I want to protect people, I told him, and it was the most honest thing I had said in years. I've studied fraud academically. I've learned how it works, how intelligent people rationalize it, how systems fail. I want to use that knowledge to prevent it, to catch it, to stop good institutions from being destroyed by internal corruption. He nodded slowly. We get a lot of applications, he said. Most people want the title or the salary. But forensic accounting requires a specific kind of mind, a person who can see patterns, who can think like a criminal without becoming one. I can do that, I said. Then he asked me to walk him through a case study. He presented a hypothetical scenario, a high-end retail company with suspicious inventory discrepancies, inflated asset values, shell corporations, evidence of money laundering. I had prepared for this question, but the universe had decided to be poetic about it. I described the case in clinical detail. I explained how an intelligent but undisciplined perpetrator might set up the shell corporation. I outlined the documentation they would need to forge. I described the banking pattern they would use. Identified the specific forensic accounting markers that would alert an experienced investigator to the scheme. Mr. Davies listened with increasing focus. "This is very specific," he said when I finished. "Have you encountered a case like this?" "Only in theory," I lied. "But I've seen enough financial systems to understand how they fail." He offered me the job that same afternoon. Senior forensic investigator, specializing in complex corporate fraud, excellent salary, full benefits, and most importantly, access to the bank's internal systems, investigative files, and the authority to audit any company that held loans with Northwood Financial, including the Hayes collection. I gave myself 1 week to prepare before I started at Northwood. During that week, I did 2 things. First, I purchased a small, inconspicuous security camera, the kind designed to look like a smoke detector, and installed it in my apartment, facing my home office desk. I told myself it was to protect the evidence I was compiling, but the truth was more complicated. I was terrified that Leo would break in again, that he would try to access my computers, that he would try to destroy the evidence I had gathered. My fear was not baseless. It was strategic. I needed documented proof that if anything happened to my files, it wasn't my doing. Second, I began compiling what I called the forensic disclosure file. This was separate from the encrypted drive with the bank records. This was a comprehensive, chronological document that proved 2 critical things: that I had been documenting my family's crimes, not participating in them, that I had records of every conversation where my parents asked me to commit fraud, that I had evidence of Leo's increasingly desperate attempts to hide his money laundering. Every page I added to that file was a shield against prosecution. Every email I printed, every document I gathered, every timeline I created, these were the threads I would use to stitch together my own legal protection. I knew, with the clarity of someone who had spent years in the shadows, that I was building a case, not against my family alone, but for my own survival. I started at Northwood Financial on a Monday morning. Mr. Davies gave me a full tour of the fraud investigation department. He showed me the secure servers where sensitive case files were stored. He explained the protocols for evidence handling, the legal requirements for investigations, the standards we had to meet to present a case to federal prosecutors. Then he handed me a file folder. "I'm giving you our most urgent case," he said. "This came across my desk this morning, and something about it bothered me. I want you to start here. Use your best judgment. I trust your instincts." I opened the folder. The title page read, "The Hayes Collection, Forensic Audit Request." The universe, it turned out, had a sense of perfect timing. I worked on the case obsessively, 18-hour days locked in my new office. I was meticulous, professional, and completely thorough. I wasn't just investigating my family's crimes. I was building a case that would be bulletproof in court. I documented everything: the Shell Corporation and its fabricated transactions, the forged invoices, the money trails leading to offshore accounts, the pattern of Leo's escalating theft over 8 years. The moment my parents became aware of the scheme and chose complicity over disclosure. I kept 2 files separate: the official forensic audit file, which was comprehensive and damning, and the forensic disclosure file, which proved that I had been documenting these crimes for months, that I had evidence of Leo's break-in to my apartment, that I had been gathering proof of my family's guilt while maintaining my own legal distance. By day 4, I had everything I needed. But before I could move forward, something happened that I should have anticipated. My father showed up at Northwood Financial. He bypassed security with bluster and family charm, and somehow convinced the receptionist that he was a consultant with an appointment. By the time the security team realized he didn't belong, he had found my office and was sitting in my chair, his face a mask of desperation and rage. "Lillian," he said quietly, "we need to talk." I stood in the doorway, very still. You need to leave, Dad. Your mother is sick with worry, he continued. She's been hospitalized. The stress is destroying her health. If you don't help us, Leo is going to be ruined. Do you want to see your brother go to jail? Do you want to destroy this family? He was doing it, the manipulation that had worked on me for 31 years. He was twisting the knife of guilt and family obligation and love. Dad, I said, my voice steady and cold in a way I didn't know I was capable of. I am legally obliged to report fraud. You taught me ethics. You taught me that right and wrong matter. Now please leave, or I will call security. He stumbled out, realizing for the first time that his manipulation had finally failed forever. The official forensic audit report was finalized. 200 pages of meticulous documentation. Every crime, every transaction, every moment of complicity. I handed it to Mr. Davies. Mr. Davies, I said, my voice steady, this is the official finding. The primary offender is Leo Hayes. The company is insolvent. The scheme involves bank fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion at a scale of approximately $3.8 million over 8 years. I paused. Then I placed the second file on his desk. However, you should also know that I have maintained a separate documentation file. The parents, Arthur and Vivian Hayes, had full knowledge of the scheme and actively participated in the tax evasion component. I have evidence that they specifically instructed me to manipulate inventory records to conceal the fraud. Mr. Davies's face went very still. Lillian, he said slowly, are you telling me you have a personal connection to this case? I am telling you, I said carefully, that I have evidence. Professional, documented evidence, which I am providing to you now, officially, as a Northwood financial employee tasked with investigating fraud. Do you need legal representation? He asked. I already have it, I said. I have cooperated fully with this bank, and I have evidence that I was documenting these crimes, not participating in them. He nodded. We'll need to report this to the federal prosecutors. You understand that? I understand, I said. The bank's reaction was swift and devastating. They called in the commercial loan immediately. They demanded a full accounting within 48 hours. They filed criminal charges against Leo for embezzlement and bank fraud. They launched civil litigation against Arthur and Vivian Hayes for tax evasion and fraudulent representation. The family's entire wealth was frozen. Their primary home, the business, their personal accounts, everything. My mother called me, her voice a mixture of rage and hysteria. You destroyed us, she screamed. You destroyed your own family. How could you? I listened to every word. Then I hung up and blocked her number. She tried calling from my father's phone. I blocked that too. She sent emails. I deleted them without reading past the subject line. I had spent 31 years carrying their weight. I had committed crimes to protect them. I had sacrificed my education, my career, my freedom. And when I finally chose myself, they called it betrayal. The public humiliation was the final blow. My lawyer arranged the service of bankruptcy papers strategically. He served them while my parents were attempting to host a desperate charity event at their seized, half-empty home, a final attempt to salvage their reputation with the people who had once called them friends. I received the call from my lawyer confirming the service. My mother, he reported, had been hysterical. She had screamed in front of their few remaining society friends that I had destroyed them. The public dismissal of my degree had found its mirror in the public humiliation of their fall. And I felt nothing. No satisfaction. No revenge. No joy. Only the profound relief of someone who had finally set down an impossibly heavy burden. My life, meanwhile, soared. Mr. Davies, recognizing my unparalleled expertise, promoted me to senior investigator within 3 months. My case studies on the Hayes collection scheme became required reading in federal fraud investigations training. I was invited to give presentations to law enforcement agencies across the state. I rented a beautiful apartment in the city, sunlit, quiet, far from the suffocating influence of family drama. I traveled. I spent time with people I chose. I built a life that was entirely authentically mine. The Hayes family, meanwhile, imploded in spectacular fashion. The Hayes collection was liquidated. All proceeds went to repay the bank and the IRS. Leo, unable to handle the pressure of accountability, attempted to start a party planning service. It failed within weeks. He had never learned how to work. He had never developed skills. He had never been forced to try. He ended up living with a distant cousin, working retail, the golden child reduced to absolute mediocrity. My parents were left with a small apartment, legal bills they couldn't pay, and the knowledge that their daughter had been the one to expose them. I received no calls, no pleas, no attempts at reconciliation. They were too busy dealing with bankruptcy courts, criminal defense lawyers, and the crippling shame of their entire social circle abandoning them. I found the true poetic justice in a small newspaper article I discovered 6 months later. It reported on the liquidation of the Hayes collection and the criminal charges against the Hayes family. But more than that, it highlighted my role in the investigation. Forensic accountant Lillian Hayes breaks massive fraud scheme at family company, the headline read. Lillian Hayes. My name. My achievement. For the first time in my entire life, my name was associated with success instead of service, with integrity instead of complicity, with justice instead of sacrifice. The greatest victory was the healing that followed. I had spent so long feeling responsible for my family's bad decisions. I had internalized their criticism, their entitlement, their casual cruelty. I had believed that my worth was somehow dependent on their approval, on their attendance at my ceremonies, on their recognition of my achievements. But my doctorate had never been just a piece of paper. It had been the thing that saved me. 6 months after the investigation concluded, Mr. Davies asked me to give a presentation to the entire Northwood Financial Executive Board on the dangers of corporate fraud. My case study? The Hayes collection. I stood in a boardroom filled with the most powerful people in the financial sector and presented the detailed forensic evidence of my family's crimes. I never revealed the personal connection, but I used the story of Leo's entitlement and my parents' complicity as a powerful lesson on how intelligent people rationalize fraud, how family dynamics can distort ethics, how institutions must have oversight to prevent internal corruption. The irony was exquisite. My parents' crimes had become a cautionary tale used to train fraud investigators across the state. My father would never know that his daughter had become an expert in preventing people like him from destroying institutions. My mother would never understand that her casual dismissal of my doctorate had led directly to the very crime that had destroyed their lives. And I had finally made peace with that. My lawyer confirmed the final legal seal on my freedom. Due to my cooperation with the bank and my comprehensive evidence documentation, I was fully shielded from any legal action. The years I spent covering for my family had ultimately become the precise evidence that saved me. The woman who was told her doctorate was just a piece of paper had become legally and professionally untouchable. I stood in my new, sunlit office at Northwood Financial, looking out at the city. The memory of the auditorium, the empty chairs, the cruel text message, the sound of pomp and circumstance playing as my family celebrated my brother's mediocrity was distant, not gone, but transformed. It had become a scar, and scars mean you survived. I used my first major bonus to take the trip I had canceled 5 years earlier. I spent 2 weeks traveling through Europe, Paris, Rome, Barcelona, celebrating alone, raising a glass to the woman who had finally saved herself from the tyranny of fake love and financial abuse. I had walked away, not just from a toxic family, but into a life of authentic power, safety, and triumph. I had earned this, and I would never apologize for it. If you've made it this far, you understand. Respect is non-negotiable. My worth wasn't defined by the empty seats at my graduation or the cash they diverted to Leo's pool party. My story proves that silence can be a weapon, and patience, the patience to document years of fraud, can be the ultimate power. If this resonated with you, if a parent or sibling has gaslit you into invisibility by calling your achievements just a piece of paper, tell yourself this: your silence doesn't make you weak. Your boundaries don't make you difficult. Your survival makes you extraordinary. Never let them turn your genius into their legal crutch. The revolution happens when you decide to write your own ending. They said Leo's happiness was the priority. I became the forensic investigator who seized their entire collection. Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.